April 1945. The Ruhr Valley, Western Germany. The air tasted of ash and iron. Smoke from burning oil refineries curled into a pale spring sky, staining the horizon the color of old bruises. In the remains of what had once been a Wehrmacht field hospital, now nothing more than a shattered monastery with half its roof caved in, 24 German nurses moved through the corridors like ghosts. Their uniforms, once crisp white with the Red Cross emblazoned proudly on the chest, were now gray with filth, stained with blood that had long since turned brown. Some wore the same aprons they had put on a week ago. Others had torn strips from bedsheets to fashion bandages, tourniquets, anything to keep the dying alive a few hours longer. The sound of artillery had finally stopped. For 3 days, the thunder had rolled without pause, shaking dust from the monastery's ancient stones, causing the wounded to cry out in their morphine dreams. Now there was only silence, and silence in war is never a comfort. It means something has ended. It means someone has won. Oberschwester Margarethe Halser stood in the courtyard, her hands trembling as she tried to light a cigarette with a match that kept going out in the breeze. She was 37 years old, though she looked 50. Her hair, once a rich chestnut, had begun to streak with white. She had not seen her reflection in weeks. There were no mirrors left intact, and even if there were, she wasn't sure she wanted to see what the war had made of her. Around her, the other nurses whispered nervously, glancing toward the road where the sound of engines grew louder. American engines. The deep, confident rumble of trucks that did not sputter, did not stall, did not beg for fuel that no longer existed. When the first U.S. Army vehicles rolled into the courtyard, Margarethe felt her stomach tighten. She had been told stories. Every German had been told stories. The Americans were liberators to some, conquerors to others, but to those who had worn the uniform of the Reich, even the medical corps, there was only uncertainty. What would they do to nurses who had tended to SS officers, to Wehrmacht soldiers, to boys who had believed in a Führer who had promised them the world and delivered them into ruin? The trucks stopped. Dust rose in lazy clouds. The doors opened, and American medics stepped out, young men, most of them, wearing clean uniforms and helmets painted with red crosses. They carried crates. They moved with the kind of ease that comes from being well-fed, well-rested, well-supplied. One of them, a corporal with a Wisconsin accent and freckles across his sunburned nose, looked around the courtyard and shook his head slowly. He said something to the man beside him, something Margarethe couldn't hear, but she saw the expression on his face. Not hatred, not triumph, something closer to pity. And then they began to unload. To understand what happened in that courtyard, in that moment when American medics opened their crates and German nurses stood frozen in disbelief, one must first understand the chasm that separated these two worlds. Not the chasm of ideology, though that was vast. Not the chasm of language, though that was real. But the chasm of material reality, the brutal, undeniable mathematics of supply and abundance. By April 1945, Germany was a nation that had been bled dry. The war machine that had once rolled across Europe with such terrifying efficiency now sputtered on fumes. The 1,000-year Reich, in its 12th year, was collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Cities lay in ruins. Factories had been bombed into silence. The railway networks, once the pride of German engineering, were shattered steel and scorched earth. Food was rationed to the point of starvation. Soap was a luxury. Clean water was a memory. For the medical personnel of the Wehrmacht and the German Red Cross, the deterioration had been gradual, then sudden. In the early years of the war, 1940-1941, there had been pride in the efficiency of German field hospitals. The nurses had clean linens, proper surgical instruments, enough bandages and antiseptics to treat the wounded with something resembling modern medicine. But as the war ground on, as the factories that produced gauze and morphine were repurposed to produce bullets and bombs, as the trucks that might have carried medical supplies were sent instead to carry ammunition to the crumbling fronts, everything began to fall apart. By 1943, nurses were reusing bandages, boiling them in water that was often contaminated, wrapping them around wounds that would inevitably become infected. By 1944, they were making do without anesthesia, holding down screaming soldiers while doctors sawed through shattered limbs with instruments that had not been properly sterilized in months. By 1945, in the final chaotic weeks of the Reich's collapse, there were hospitals operating without electricity, without running water, without even the most basic supplies. Nurses used newspapers as bandages. They used schnapps as disinfectant. They used their own bodies to warm soldiers dying of shock, because there were no blankets left. Margarethe Halser had joined the nursing corps in 1939, a young woman filled with a sense of duty, a belief that she was serving something greater than herself. She had been apolitical, or so she told herself. She did not march in the rallies, did not raise her arm in salute with any particular enthusiasm. She simply wanted to heal. But the war had taught her things that no nursing school could have prepared her for. It taught her that ideals are fragile things, easily shattered by the reality of a 16-year-old boy bleeding out on a stone floor, calling for his mother in a voice that grows quieter and quieter until it stops. It taught her that there is no glory in suffering, no honor in watching men die because there is no penicillin, no morphine, no hope. She had not eaten a full meal in 6 days. None of them had. The Wehrmacht had abandoned them 3 days before the Americans arrived, taking with them the last of the medical supplies, the last of the food, the last of the vehicles. The nurses and the wounded were left behind, forgotten in the chaos of retreat. They had survived on what they could scavenge: potatoes stolen from a burned-out farmhouse, stale bread that tasted of mold, water from a well that might or might not be safe to drink. And then the Americans came. The first crate that was opened contained towels. Not rags. Not torn strips of cloth salvaged from destroyed uniforms. Towels. Real towels, thick and white, folded in neat stacks, each one clean and soft and impossibly bright in the gray light of the courtyard. The American medic who lifted them out did so casually, as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. He handed one to the nearest German nurse, a young woman named Ilse who had been working without sleep for 36 hours. She took it with both hands, staring at it as if it were a holy relic. Margarethe watched Ilse's face. She watched the way the girl's eyes widened, the way her mouth opened slightly, the way her fingers trembled as they touched the fabric. And then Ilse did something that Margarethe would remember for the rest of her life. She pressed the towel to her face and inhaled deeply, breathing in the scent of detergent and cleanliness, and she began to cry. It was not loud. It was not dramatic. It was the quiet, exhausted weeping of someone who has been holding themselves together through sheer force of will and has suddenly been given permission to fall apart. Other nurses gathered around, reaching out to touch the towels, to feel the texture, to confirm that they were real. One woman laughed, a strange, broken sound that was half sob. Another simply stood there, clutching a towel to her chest, her eyes closed. The American medic looked uncomfortable. He said something in English, words that Margarethe did not understand, but the tone was clear. "It's okay. It's just a towel. We have more." But it was not just a towel. It was evidence of a world that still existed somewhere beyond the ruins, a world where there were factories that produced such things in abundance, where there were supply lines that could deliver them to the front, where there was enough of everything, that a towel could be given away without a second thought. It was evidence that the stories they had been told, the propaganda that had sustained them through years of deprivation, had been lies. The Americans were not starving. They were not desperate. They were not on the verge of collapse. They had towels. The transformation began with small things. After the towels came soap, bars of it, more soap than Margarethe had seen in 2 years. Then came clean sheets, rolls of gauze, bottles of iodine and antiseptic, vials of morphine and penicillin. The American medics set up a field station in the monastery's chapel, working alongside the German nurses as if there had never been a war between them, as if the uniforms they wore did not represent nations that had been trying to annihilate each other for 6 years. Margarethe found herself working next to a young American lieutenant named Patterson. He was from Ohio, he told her in broken German, and before the war he had been a medical student. He worked with a quiet efficiency that she recognized, the efficiency of someone who has seen too much death and has learned to focus on what can be saved rather than what cannot. He showed her how to administer the penicillin, how much to use, how often. He handed her supplies as if she were his colleague, not his enemy. He did not ask her about the war. He did not ask her about the Reich. He asked her how long she had been a nurse, and when she told him, he nodded and said, "That's good. We need experienced hands." It was such a small thing, that acknowledgement. But it cracked something open inside her. For years, she had been told that she was serving the fatherland, that her sacrifices were necessary, that the suffering was temporary, that victory was inevitable. And then, when victory proved to be a lie, she had been abandoned, left to fend for herself and her patients in a collapsing world. The Americans did not abandon their medics. They sent them supplies. They sent them reinforcements. They sent them fresh towels. Over the next few days, Margarethe watched as the wounded German soldiers, boys, most of them, some as young as 15, received treatment that they could not have imagined weeks before. The Americans had blood plasma. They had surgical kits. They had painkillers. They had food, real food, not the watery soup and moldy bread that had been the standard ration for months. The soldiers ate canned peaches and stared at the syrup as if it were liquid gold. Some of them wept. Others simply ate in silence, too stunned to speak. One evening, as the sun set over the ruins of the Ruhr, Margarethe stood in the courtyard and watched a group of American soldiers playing baseball in a clearing near the monastery. They had set up makeshift bases using helmets and pieces of wood, and they were laughing, shouting, arguing over whether a ball had been fair or foul. It was absurd. It was impossible. 30 kilometers away, men were still dying. The war was not over. And yet here were these Americans playing a game, as if war were something that could be paused, set aside, returned to when necessary. Lieutenant Patterson saw her watching and walked over. He offered her a cigarette, an American cigarette, not the harsh, throat-burning tobacco of German rations. She took it, and he lit it for her, cupping his hand around the match to shield it from the breeze. "Strange, isn't it?" he said in his careful German. "All of this." Margarethe nodded. She did not trust herself to speak. "Back home," Patterson continued, "people don't really understand. They think war is all the time. They think it's constant. But it's not. It's moments. Moments of terror, and then moments like this. And you have to hold on to moments like this, or you go crazy." Margarethe took a drag from the cigarette and watched the smoke curl into the darkening sky. "You have so much," she said quietly. "You have everything." Patterson was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Yeah, I guess we do." He did not say it with pride. He did not say it with guilt. He said it as a fact, a simple truth that required no elaboration. America had everything. Germany had nothing. And that difference, more than any battle, more than any strategy, had decided the war. The towels became a symbol. Not officially. Not in any document or report. But among the German nurses, the towels represented something that went beyond mere material comfort. They represented a system, a society, a way of organizing the world that could produce abundance even in the midst of war. Every time Margarethe used a clean towel, to dry a patient's face, to wrap a wound, to simply wipe her own hands, she thought about the factory where it had been made, the workers who had woven the fabric, the trucks that had carried it across an ocean and then across a continent, the supply officers who had deemed it necessary to include towels, of all things, in a shipment to the front lines. In Germany, they had been told that such abundance was a lie, a decadent illusion that would collapse under the discipline and determination of the Reich. They had been told that Americans were soft, materialistic, incapable of true sacrifice. But the evidence was everywhere, undeniable and overwhelming. The Americans were not soft. They were simply organized in a way that prioritized the welfare of their soldiers, that understood that a well-supplied army was a more effective army, that recognized that small comforts, a clean towel, a hot meal, a moment of rest, could mean the difference between endurance and collapse. Margarethi began to ask questions. Not aloud, not at first, but in the privacy of her own mind. She thought about the boys she had treated, the ones who had died not because their wounds were untreatable, but because there had been no medicine, no equipment, no supplies. She thought about the soldiers who had frozen to death on the Eastern Front because there had been no winter uniforms, no proper coats, no way to keep them warm. She thought about the propaganda films she had seen, the images of German might and invincibility, and she compared them to the reality of American logistics, the endless convoys of trucks, the airplanes that dropped supplies even in contested territory, the field hospitals that had more resources than some German city hospitals had possessed before the war. One of the other nurses, a woman named Greta who had been a fervent believer in the Reich, approached Margarethi late one night. They were alone in the chapel, preparing supplies for the next day's surgeries. Greta held up a roll of gauze, American gauze, and stared at it as if it were a puzzle she could not solve. "How?" she asked simply. Margarethi knew what she was asking. How did they have so much? How did they manage it? How did they win? "They planned for it," Margarethi said. "They built for it. They didn't just rely on willpower and ideology. They made sure their soldiers had what they needed." Greta was silent for a long time. Then she said, "We were lied to." It was not a question. It was a statement, flat and emotionless. Margarethi did not respond. There was nothing to say. They had been lied to. About the war, about the enemy, about what was possible and what was not. And the proof was in the towels, in the soap, in the medicine, in the food. The proof was in the fact that they had survived not because the Reich had provided for them, but because the Americans had. The historical record, when examined closely, reveals that the experience of German medical personnel encountering American supply abundance was not unique to that monastery in the Ruhr. It was repeated across Germany, from the Rhine to the Elbe, in field hospitals and aid stations, in prisoner-of-war camps and liberated territories. American forces, operating under a logistical system that had been refined over years of global war, brought with them a level of material support that stunned both their enemies and their allies. The United States Army Medical Department, by 1945, was a marvel of organization and efficiency. It operated on the principle that every wounded soldier deserved the best possible care, and it backed that principle with resources that dwarfed those of any other nation. American field hospitals were equipped with portable X-ray machines, blood banks, surgical theaters that could be set up and operational within hours. The supply chain that supported these hospitals stretched back across the Atlantic, a vast network of factories, ships, trains, and trucks that delivered everything from scalpels to bandages to fresh towels. German military medicine, by contrast, had been crippled by the Nazi regime's priorities. Resources that might have gone to medical supplies were diverted to weapons production. Personnel who might have served in the medical corps were sent to the front lines as combat soldiers. The ideology of the Reich, with its emphasis on strength and sacrifice, had little patience for the wounded. Soldiers were expected to endure, to suffer, to die if necessary, for the greater glory of the nation. Comfort was a weakness. Abundance was a decadence. The American approach was different, rooted in a fundamentally different understanding of what it meant to wage war. The United States, with its industrial capacity, its democratic institutions, its cultural emphasis on individual welfare, had built a military system that treated soldiers not as expendable resources but as valuable assets to be preserved and maintained. This was not altruism. It was pragmatism. A soldier who received proper medical care could return to the fight. A soldier who was well-fed and well-equipped fought more effectively. A soldier who believed that his nation cared about his survival was more willing to risk that survival when necessary. The towels, in this context, were not a luxury. They were a component of a system designed to maintain morale, prevent disease, and ensure that medical personnel could perform their duties effectively. The American military understood that hygiene was not a trivial concern, that infections killed as surely as bullets, that the psychological impact of cleanliness and order could not be underestimated. German nurses, who had spent years working in conditions that violated every principle of modern medicine, could see the difference immediately. It was not just that the Americans had more. It was that they had thought about what more meant, and they had organized their entire war effort around providing it. Historians have documented the reactions of German prisoners and civilians who encountered American abundance for the first time. The reports are remarkably consistent. Disbelief, confusion, resentment, admiration, shame. One German officer, captured in the final weeks of the war, wrote in his diary, "They have so much that they are careless with it. They throw away food that we would have fought over. They discard equipment that we would have repaired and reused a dozen times. It is not that they are better soldiers than we are. It is that they have made a different kind of war, one that we could never have won." Margarethe Halser would have understood that sentiment. She had not been a soldier, but she had seen the war from the inside, had witnessed the slow collapse of the Reich's ability to care for its own people. And she had seen, in the space of a few days, what the alternative looked like. It looked like clean towels. It looked like medicine that worked. It looked like young men playing baseball in the ruins of Europe, not because they were naive or ignorant, but because they came from a place that had not been destroyed, that had not exhausted itself, that could afford to be generous even in victory. The war in Europe ended less than a month after the Americans arrived at the monastery. Margarethe heard the news on a crackling radio that one of the American medics had set up in the chapel. Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen. The Reich had surrendered. It should have felt momentous, she thought. It should have felt like the end of something. Instead, it felt like the confirmation of something she had already known. The war had been over for a long time. They had simply been too stubborn or too afraid to admit it. In the days that followed, the American medics prepared to move on. Their work at the monastery was done. The wounded had been stabilized, the most critical cases evacuated to better-equipped hospitals in the rear. The German nurses were to remain, under Allied supervision, to continue caring for the soldiers who were still too weak to be moved. Lieutenant Patterson came to say goodbye to Margarethe. He shook her hand, a firm American handshake, and told her that she had done good work. "You saved a lot of lives," he said. Margarethe shook her head. "You saved them. We had nothing." Patterson smiled, a small, sad smile. "You had yourselves. That's not nothing." He handed her a package before he left. It was wrapped in brown paper, tied with string. She opened it after he was gone and found inside a stack of clean white towels, more than she could possibly use, and a note written in careful block letters. "For the next time. So you're ready." She stood there in the empty chapel, holding the towels, and for the first time in 6 years she allowed herself to imagine a future. Not a grand future, not a future of ideology or empire or glory. Just a future where there were enough towels, where there was enough medicine, where there was enough food, where there was simply enough. The significance of that moment, the moment when German nurses gasped at the sight of fresh towels, extends far beyond the personal experiences of those women. It represents a turning point in the understanding of what modern war required and what modern society could provide. The Second World War was, in many ways, a contest not just of armies but of systems, a test of which form of social organization could mobilize resources most effectively, sustain a population under extreme stress, and maintain the moral and material cohesion necessary for victory. The totalitarian states, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Imperial Japan, had bet everything on the idea that discipline, hierarchy, and ideological fervor could overcome material disadvantage. They had built war machines that were, in their initial phases, terrifyingly effective. But they had built them on foundations that could not sustain prolonged conflict. They had prioritized conquest over care, expansion over maintenance, glory over pragmatism. And in the end, they had been defeated not primarily by superior tactics or braver soldiers, but by superior logistics, superior organization, and superior abundance. The democracies, Britain, the United States, and their allies, had proven that free societies, with their messy politics and their emphasis on individual rights, could nonetheless organize themselves for total war. More than that, they had proven that such societies could do so without abandoning the principles that defined them. American soldiers were well supplied not because the United States was willing to sacrifice everything for victory, but because it was unwilling to sacrifice its own people unnecessarily. British resilience was not the result of totalitarian control, but of a social contract that promised care and support in exchange for sacrifice and service. The towels, in this larger narrative, were a symbol of that promise. They represented a society that valued the dignity and welfare of its citizens, even in the midst of war. They represented a logistical system that could deliver not just the essentials of survival, but the small comforts that made survival bearable. They represented a fundamentally different vision of what war could be, not a descent into barbarism, but an organized, rational, even humane endeavor, conducted with the goal of returning, as quickly as possible, to peace. Margarethe Halser lived for another 40 years after the war ended. She never spoke much about her time in the nursing corps, never sought recognition or compensation for her service. She worked in a hospital in Frankfurt, training a new generation of nurses, teaching them the skills she had learned in the worst possible circumstances. But she kept one of the towels that Lieutenant Patterson had given her. She kept it in a drawer in her apartment, folded neatly, never used. It was not a relic of victory or defeat. It was a reminder of the moment when she understood that the world was larger and more complex than she had been taught, that abundance was possible, that systems mattered, that choices had consequences. In her final years, when her grandchildren asked her about the war, she would sometimes take out the towel and let them touch it. It was old by then, yellowed with age, the fabric worn thin. But it was still soft, still clean. And she would tell them, in her quiet, careful way, that this towel had taught her more about the war than any battle, any speech, any propaganda film. It had taught her that the world was divided not just by borders and ideologies, but by the simple question of whether a society could take care of its own people. And that question, she believed, was the one that mattered most. There is a photograph, taken in the spring of 1945, that survives in the archives of the United States Army Medical Corps. It shows a group of German nurses standing in a courtyard, surrounded by American medics. In the foreground, a young woman holds a white towel to her face, her eyes closed, her expression unreadable. Behind her, other women reach out toward a stack of supplies, their hands extended, their faces a mixture of exhaustion and wonder. The photograph is not dramatic. It does not capture a moment of violence or heroism. It captures something quieter, something more fundamental. It captures the moment when the war, for those women, became something different. Not a story of good versus evil, but a story of systems and choices, of what was possible and what was not. The American medic who took the photograph wrote on the back, in fading pencil, "German nurses, Ruhr Valley, April 1945. First time they'd seen clean supplies in months. Cried when we gave them towels." It is a small note, an unremarkable observation. But it contains within it the entire arc of the war. The collapse of one world. The emergence of another. The recognition that victory was not just a matter of force, but of capacity. The capacity to produce, to supply, to care. The towels were not a weapon. They were not a strategy. But they were, in their own way, as decisive as any bomb or bullet. They were the proof that one side had built a system that worked, and the other had not. And in the end, that was what the war had been about. Not just territory or ideology or revenge, but the question of which vision of the future could sustain itself, which system could provide not just for its warriors but for all its people, which society could look at the ruins of Europe and say, with confidence and without hesitation, "We will rebuild. We will care for you. We have enough." The fresh white towels, folded and clean and impossibly abundant, were the first evidence that such a world was possible. And for the German nurses who gasped when they received them, who pressed them to their faces and wept, that evidence changed everything. It changed their understanding of the war. It changed their understanding of the enemy. It changed their understanding of what the future might hold. It did not erase the past. It did not absolve them of their choices or their complicity. But it gave them something they had not had in years. It gave them hope. And hope, in the spring of 1945, in the ruins of a defeated nation, was the rarest and most precious resource of all.